Okay, there we go. So, yes, hi everyone. My name is Luke, and I guess you can put a face to the name that's been spamming you for the last few months. But I'll be talking, as Mark mentioned, about an update for one of our working groups. And this was an idea that stemmed from the previous GUBIC meeting, and we just took this one forward. And as Mark showed earlier, managed to submit it to Urban Ecosystems last year, and we're still waiting on feedback for that. But it's titled Prioritization and Thresholds for Managing Biological Invasions in Urban Ecosystems. So as Mark alluded to a bit earlier, invasive alien species in cities provide a range of problems and are there for a number of reasons and are successful for a number of reasons. And I'll just highlight some of these, and obviously these will be discussed in detail throughout the meeting, but obviously cities are foci for alien species introductions. There are high rates of propagular pressure, habitat heterogeneity, increased resource availability, high level of disturbance, range of dispersal pathways and vectors, and altered climatic conditions. And of course, a lot of the opportunities that are afforded to alien species to establish and become problems are the result of human activities. But of course, managing invasive species in cities has its own unique set of challenges. Other than the usual challenges of limited resources, competing priorities, etc., cities have many land parcels, diverse stakeholders with different opinions and views, which can complicate management attempts. And traditionally, management approaches for cities have been relying on methods developed for natural and rural areas. But what we really need is a strategic management to include these four questions: the what, where, and when. And I'll describe the how to manage as well a bit later on. But these are the fundamental questions that we need to think strategically about. So for this specific project, we wanted to know what triggers management of invasive species in cities. And we looked at, the first step was to obviously do a literature review to see what is out there and what are the underlying reasons or thresholds or triggers that are there galvanizing the management of invasive species in cities. So in terms of the why manage invasive species in cities, they're obviously impact biodiversity, ecosystem services, and human well-being. But these impacts tend to manifest in different ways compared to rural and natural areas. There's obviously a range of ecological, economic, and social impacts, and these tend to be felt more acutely as a result of the diversity and just high density of people as stakeholders that are in the cities. And these impacts can be very highly context specific. And just some examples there in the box on the right, we have the common ragweed, which is a problematic invasive species in much of Europe where the polygen is allergenic. We've got the tiger mosquito, which obviously impacts human health, the emerald ash borer, which has devastated millions and millions of trees in much of North America. We've got Australian acacias, eucalypts, and pines, which are obviously major problems in particularly Mediterranean ecosystems like Spain, Portugal, and South Africa, which is particularly hard hit. And then the Eurasian milfoil, which has been shown to reduce property values in parts of the US. But of course, invasive species also provide benefits to urban residents, and attempts to manage around these issues really is really complicated by the fact that there are often conflicts of interest. And then what should be managed? And this speaks really to prioritization. And obviously invasive species are very costly to manage. They're limited resources, so these resources must be used wisely. And the management context for prioritization varies in scope and objective. And I've just pulled out some figures from Melody's paper in 2016, which flags these three main focuses for prioritization: and the species, vectors and pathways, and invaded or susceptible sites. And as I mentioned before, there's this need specifically in urban areas to integrate both positive and negative impacts to avoid these potential conflicts that might arise when attempting to manage. But of course, each prioritization approach has particular data requirements. And then the when to manage. And this is really the crux of where we wanted to go with this project. And some of the key questions were, things like when is management intervention required to address undesirable ecosystem changes? And this obviously refers to invasive species that are creating this undesirable change within urban ecosystems. And as Mark mentioned, there's these concepts of management thresholds and decision triggers, which have been discussed in the literature. I think Carly Cook has done quite a substantial amount of work on this. And this is essentially, so setting decision triggers requires that an attribute be identified, and this attribute can be ecological, economic, or social. And that attribute needs to serve as an indicator for the state of the system or the invasion process that is the target for management. And a trigger point can be designed to occur at a management threshold recognized by the management organization to require a specific response. So decision triggers can be informed by value judgments, integrating stakeholder priorities, which are referred to as utility thresholds. And then obviously ecological knowledge about the state of the system, which are referred to as ecological thresholds. So we developed this, this framework, which is really focused around those 3.5 key questions. For the how to manage, we didn't explicitly delve into that aspect in this paper, but we obviously bring it in because it's key for the actual tactical control operational side of things. So this framework is basically looking at the key considerations for establishing invasive species management thresholds to inform decision making in cities and how they relate to the stages of invasion. And at the bottom here, you have the introduction, naturalization, invasion continuum, which is essentially just a simplified framework from Blackburn's framework in 2011, and just highlighting those key stages. And the four key questions are here with the relevant factors that are associated with that question. I won't go through every single arrow in this framework, but I'll just give you a few examples. For example, this arrow A here refers to an assessment of the impacts of invasive alien species in cities can be used as a means of setting a management threshold. And these impacts tend to increase along the invasion continuum, but they can obviously manifest in different ways, affecting various aspects of the socio-ecological system. And then another example would be B1 here, from impacts to prioritization, where prioritization can occur at all stages of the continuum, the invasion continuum. For example, high-risk introduction pathways can be prioritized before any impacts are realized, and this refers to risk assessments. So it kind of is complicated looking at it from initially, but I think it captures kind of that complexity that is inherent in management of invasive species in cities. Sorry, it just seems like it's been frozen. There we go. So the first step would be to have a look at what literature is out there and what it says about these thresholds and decision triggers. So we obviously reviewed the scientific literature to identify commonly used prioritization approaches, decision triggers, and management thresholds for invasive species in cities. And 137 publications were indexed, and of the 75 studies met our inclusion criteria. And most of the studies excluded from our analysis either briefly referenced invasions in a city or cities, but it was not the focus of the study, or the study failed to address explicitly invasive species in the context of urban areas. So for example, invasions in neighboring rural areas. So I'll just jump straight into the results here. The top left figure just shows the geographic distribution of studies included in our analysis. And as is the case with many fields in science, you have a bias towards North America, so the USA and Canada. We have Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa stand out as some of the key countries in which many of these studies are taking place. And then, as usual, much of the global south is underrepresented. And then the figure on the graph on the right is the proportion of studies included in the analysis at the country scale. And studies at smaller scales were scaled up to country scale for this figure. And here, the highest percentage of studies that provide prioritization, management thresholds, or decision triggers, or just general management recommendations were at the global scale, so all countries there at the top. And then at the country scale, the highest proportion were again from the US, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. And then the bottom left figure just shows the proportion of studies at the various spatial scales, with generally all papers addressing the broader issue taking place at the city scale. And then looking more at these graphs in more detail and just separating out the decision trigger, management recommendations, and prioritization implications in more detail per country. Some studies on the provided detailed species-specific practical recommendations, so things like decision trees, assigning species to management categories, or just tailored management frameworks. But many of the studies are not explicit in their recommendations, so they would simply suggest that the study's findings have management implications broadly, or can generally be used to prioritize invasive species for management. And this has been highlighted in the literature as a broader problem for the conservation field. And then the graph on the right just shows the taxonomic groups that were assessed in the literature that we pulled out. So we have plants and insects that were best represented, and together they accounted for almost 2/3 of all the taxa studied. So I've just pulled out some other stats from this work. For the impact side of things, just under 50% of studies considered negative impacts of invasions in cities, and 24% of these studies assessed the positive impacts, so the benefits that are derived from invasive species. And then only 27% incorporated stakeholder views into the impact assessments. So for the prioritization side of things, we had 43% of studies had general implications for prioritization, but only 31% of these studies actually directly assessed priorities in these urban areas. And then for the management thresholds or decision triggers, we only had 8% that referenced a threshold or decision trigger. And I'll run through these briefly. It's 8%, it just equates to 6 studies essentially. And I've just pulled these out here. I won't go into too much detail of each study, but I'll just refer to a few. The main one being the study, or a few studies that have utilized this concept called thresholds of potential concern, which is something it's been used quite extensively in the Kruger National Park in South Africa. It uses a diverse set of indicators to inform these thresholds and the resulting decision trigger, and areas evaluated for the number of species and the density of alien species also considered, and then a score is allocated and then combined to provide a threat index for that specific region. And then, for example, another one is this study on the tiger mosquito, in which the authors present a nuisance threshold, so essentially a utility threshold, where an average of 5 or more tiger mosquito adults detected during weekly surveillance would then trigger a management action. So these are the types of things that we pulled out, and obviously very few formalized management approaches integrated into the management decision-making process. So in terms of the conclusions, our review indicates that the ways in which invasive species management are prioritized in cities and the application of formalized management thresholds informing the decision-making process are still poorly understood. And this might suggest that less formal or structured approaches to managing invasive species in cities are being used, or that management in cities is triggered by external factors. So factors like funding availability, lack of public support, or operational challenges. And these are not necessarily recorded in the formal literature. And then incorporating effective decision triggers into the management of invasive species obviously requires ongoing monitoring of indicators. And this often speaks to that operational side of things where funding isn't often available to allow for these ongoing monitoring methods to take place. And then management thresholds and decision triggers can be integrated into existing conservation planning frameworks to inform that evidence-based decision-making process. So frameworks like a general broader frameworks of adaptive management or structured decision-making. And then robust impact assessments, including both positive and negative impacts, are important in developing prioritization approaches and evidence-based thresholds for managing invasive species in cities. And as I've hopped on a bit in this talk already, is that engaging with stakeholders throughout this decision-making process is really important, and that can result in a defensible decisions about the what, when, and where invasive species are to be managed. And the next step, we plan to take this project forward and actually then look at what do urban conservation practitioners have to say. And this would involve developing questionnaires and interviews with those that are actually grappling with these issues on the ground, and to see what are the underlying factors that are driving the decision-making process to manage invasive species in cities. And with that, I'd just like to acknowledge the co-authors that have been really great on this project so far. And with that, yeah, I'll say thank you, and I'll take any questions. You're welcome to pop a question in the chat as well, if you don't mind.